Welcome to the Great Basin Weekly Fuels Briefing for Wednesday, July 1st. Over the last 7 days, we've had significant precipitation across the north with a strong cold front that moved through the area over the weekend into earlier this week. This did bring well above normal precipitation to much of central and southwest Idaho into parts of northern Nevada. Many of these areas saw over 1 to 2 inches of total precipitation. As you can see, even in the Salmon Challis area, we saw over 2 to 2.5 inches, as well as the Payette. Areas further south, precipitation was more spotty and associated with thunderstorm activity, although these areas are showing above normal for the time of year because June is a very dry month for Nevada and Utah. Still, it was very spotty with thunderstorms and very short-lived, also down into the Arizona Strip. Looking at the drought conditions, our long-term drought here on the right still shows widespread severe to extreme drought, really across much of the Great Basin. The only exceptions are across central Idaho, which is still in moderate drought, and parts of western and southern Nevada, which are also still in moderate drought or just abnormally dry. But looking at the evaporative demand drought index here on the left over the last few months, you can see many of these areas, although they're not in the longer term, more significant drought, have been showing significant drying and are even in some of the ED3 and ED4 categories over southern and eastern Nevada into Utah and the Arizona Strip. So fuels have been obviously drying very rapidly over the last couple of months, which may not be completely captured in the long-term drought. Looking at our days since rainfall, here on the left is showing days since any rainfall, so any amount, and you can see in many of these areas we have seen rainfall at most sites within the last week or so. However, if we look at rainfall amounts, areas over southern and central areas that have seen any wetting rains, it's been in some areas over a month or over 2 months in many of these spots. So again, although we did see some light precipitation that was spotty from some convection, we have not seen the widespread wetting rains. Obviously in the north, a very different picture, and we saw widespread wetting rains across those areas just in the last few days. Looking at our fire danger indices for ERC, you can see we're still experiencing ERCs above the 90th percentile over the southern half of the Great Basin and even to the 80th percentile or between the 80th and 90th in northern Utah. However, over northern areas, a much greater decrease in fire danger due to the cold front, the cold temperatures, and the precipitation. So most of those areas are between the 50th and 70th percentiles. And if we look at the change over the last week, you can see, again, we have seen our fuels moderate in all areas, although the areas in the south that did see some moderation with either the thunderstorms or just the cooling temperatures in some areas with slightly higher humidity. We also did have some cloud cover and the smoke impacts, which did keep some of the heat from the sun off of some of those areas in the south. This moderation will be very short-lived, and we will see those ERCs rebound very quickly, especially in areas that saw limited or very little moisture. Up north, again, a more drastic decrease from above the 80th percentile to now in the 50th or 60th percentiles. So again, those areas, especially in the mountainous terrain that saw recent precipitation and snowfall, will take a little bit longer to recover. But the low elevations, especially with the grass component across southern Idaho, will likely rebound much quicker. So with all of these fuel conditions in mind, we do have a Great Basin Fuel and Fire Behavior Advisory in effect for eastern Nevada, across much of Utah, except for the higher terrain in the north and down into the Arizona Strip. Obviously, the persistent drought, record low fuel moistures, both in our live and deads in many of these areas, along with fully cured fine fuels, and even seeing reports of fine fuels that are quite tall in some of the higher elevations of Utah because of the lack of snowpack. So we are seeing that extremely rapid fire growth, along with even seeing fires spread from juniper to juniper with little ground fuels. So a very significant situation, although we did see, again, that brief moderation of the fire danger, very little impact where our large incidents are, and we expect all areas to rebound quickly. And this is available on our Great Basin website. So looking at our Great Basin fire activity, obviously quite a few large team fires across the region, and they're all indicated here on the map. Those are obviously all still ongoing. Aside from that, we haven't really seen any larger fires or problem fires in the rest of Nevada or even far northern Utah near the Idaho border. However, up in Idaho, even just today, we have seen some fires pop up in the lower elevations, and these have been between about 100 and 150 acres. So again, we will start to see these lower elevation areas where the grasses are dried, see fires start to pop up more rapidly than any of our mountainous areas, which obviously we didn't have any recent fires. So looking more specifically at some of the areas First, Idaho and Wyoming. Again, we saw the ERCs drop significantly, all fire danger well below where we were about a week ago. However, we will see those ERCs trending upward. We have very hot temperatures and dry conditions coming for the weekend going into next week, so we will see well above normal temperatures, although it will take some time for many of these higher terrain areas to really rebound to where we were a week ago. We could start to see some of those values creeping up in the next 7 to 10 days. In some of the lower elevations, we expect that rise to be a little bit more rapid, and we could even see some areas that didn't see quite as much precipitation as southwest Idaho or central Idaho see some of those ERCs get closer to the 90th percentile or even above. Now, looking at live and dead fuels and fire activity across Idaho and Wyoming, we did have the Kinky Creek fire that grew to over 800 acres that started last week in the timber litter and understory with reports of bug kill. And this area was aligned with wind and slope prior to the recent moisture, however, has moderated since then. Over the rest of southern Idaho, we are seeing some smaller fires pop up, and some of these fires did grow to over 150 acres today. So in the dead grasses and in the carryover grasses, we are going to see those fires start to pop up, especially when we see the heat this weekend and the drier conditions. Otherwise, we saw a lot of new snowfall in the higher elevations and some flooding even down in the lower elevations, so quite a bit of moisture. The Payette and Salmon Challis had over 1.5 to 2 inches of rainfall and even had over 6 to 12 inches of new snowfall in some of the higher elevations. So these areas may take a week or longer before fire behavior really returns to levels they were prior to the moisture. Over in Twin Falls and the Sawtooth, timber and sagebrush fuel moisture are still at record lows for the time of year, and the cheatgrass is fully cured, although the perennial grasses were curing, but definitely that process slowed down with the recent moisture they saw, but likely we'll see that pick up again as we see hotter and drier conditions. Moving on to Nevada, our, again, ERCs obviously dropped fairly rapidly as well, especially up in northeast Nevada and across the north that saw some of that heavier precipitation. Areas further south, the decrease was a little bit more modest, and again, all areas rapidly rising, and we'll see many areas above that 90th percentile. Looking at some of the live and dead fuel moisture and fire activity, aside from the Grapevine and the Cane Springs fire in southern Ely District, really minimal significant fire activity across the state. We have seen a little bit more IA when we do have some lightning, but again, things have been pretty quiet this last week. Any recent fires burning are mostly in the cheatgrass and sagebrush, and it has been fully consuming the brush. Also, we did get some new fine fuel loading reports out of Elko, and they were averaging about 600 pounds per acre, which is actually lower than average. Moving over to Utah and the Arizona Strip, still seeing those, again, ERCs above the 90th percentile, although they have dropped off, as you can see in many of these charts. However, we'll be rebounding very quickly, and we'll see many areas really above the 90th or 97th percentile as we go into next week, especially with the building heat and drier conditions. Luckily, we won't have much wind across the region once we get towards the weekend, but we could see some of that wind pick up again next week. And then looking at some of the 1,000-hour and juniper and sagebrush fuel moistures across these critical areas of Nevada and Utah, we are seeing many areas with record low or near record low fuel moistures in all of these fuels. The 1,000 hours did come up a little bit with the any recent moisture we saw and the cooler temperatures, but again, will be dropping very quickly and could be approaching record lows again as we get into next week. We also saw some reports from Color Country at several sagebrush sites seeing increased stress in the sagebrush. They're seeing browning in the lower 2/3 of many of the plants and many losing foliage. So this will also continue to be an issue in the area where we have the fuel and fire behavior advisory. Let's look at the fire conditions and some of the other live and dead fuel conditions across Utah and the Arizona Strip. First down in the Arizona Strip, still seeing record low fuel moisture with juniper in the 60 to 70th percentile and dead fuel moisture in the 1 to 4% range. Up in Utah, again, obviously we have several large and team fires that are continuing to grow in size. Fires are burning in tall grass, timber litter, and understory, and almost every fire in Utah is growing to over 40 acres. So again, still significant conditions expected in Utah. Looking at our critical fuel status page, the difference in last week and this week is really very minor. I will say the image on the right for this week has not been updated quite yet, but the only change was in the Salmon Challis area where we saw these zones go to not critical just with their recent precipitation and snowfall. Really, all other areas of the geographic region have stayed the same with respect to critical fuel status. That concludes our weekly webcast for the fuels briefing. Check back next week for the latest updates.